Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Purple Pill Philosophy is interviewing the legendary pop scholar Michael Heiser. How are you lately?
Good. I didn't know I was legendary. Am I really that old? I hope my kids don't listen to this.
Um, Tell the dear audience about yourself.
For the last 15 years, almost 15 years, I was the scholar in residence at Faith Life Corporation. They are the makers of Logos Bible software. It's in Bellingham, Washington. I still live in the state of Washington, but we're going to be moving to Jacksonville soon in a few months, where I'm going to be the executive director of a new school that's both physical and distance. Awakening School of Theology, it's called. So it's the first year is going to focus on my content, for lack of a better term, and the second year is just kind of whatever I care about. It's really for anybody in the world who just wants 2 years of biblical theological education. We're not going to pursue accreditation deliberately. We're not interested in that. We're more interested in the non-specialist, the just the person in the local church who's going to be doing ministry to get a better handle on biblical theology and a whole assortment of topics without, costing them 100K. I mean, something has to be done here. So we're going to jump into that. Before Faith Life, I've taught for about 20 years on the Green Campus and Distance Ed for, I don't know, half a dozen different institutions, religious, Catholic school, evangelical school, secular university. So I've taught a lot, published a lot. I published peer-reviewed journal articles, several books. I do a lot of writing for again, the popular audience as well. So I'm kind of all over the place. I have a YouTube channel that focuses on sort of responses to fringe beliefs, things like ancient aliens. I mean, I've always been into, pop culture stuff. So I do that. I do a couple podcasts. Naked Bible Podcast is the big one. We crossed 6 million downloads this year.
Oh, cool.
So that's in the total, of I think it's what, 4 or 5 years or something like that. So that's biblical studies. I have a paranormal podcast where we go through peer-reviewed literature on topics that would go under the paranormal label. I write fiction too. I mean, you can find me in a lot of places. I like anything old and weird, always have. And biblical studies is, the wheelhouse. That's where my training is, and professionally, what I've done. But I'm in all sorts of places.
Interesting. One of the main topics in the unseen realm, which is what we're interviewing about tonight,
Hmm.
is the use of literary polemic by the biblical authors. Like,
Hmm.
of course, Bible bashers who don't know any better will see how similar in many instances in the Old Testament are to
Right.
stories and myths outside the Bible, like in
Yeah.
Near Eastern sources, and go along with the caricature that the Israelites were these stupid Bronze Age sheep herders that had no original ideas of their own, and then make the non
Right.
they make the non sequitur that Yahweh is contrived Canaanite storm god because it was said to have created the world exactly the way the Egyptian and Babylonian gods did, flooded the world as the Mesopotamian gods did, and battled the chaos dragon as a certain champion god did in each pantheon. So
Hmm. Yeah,
we
because if we were writing polemic, we would want to make it sound as dissimilar to the thing we're shooting at as possible, right? I mean, how would it be a polemic then?
yeah.
How would anybody know? That's the most cleverly disguised polemic that's ever been produced.
Yeah.
You're right. It's kind of an absurd set of assumptions. These people are living in the same place, regionally. Um, the notion that they could all be writing about, you know, uh, a recollected event doesn't seem to occur to some of these, Bible bashers, as you refer to them. And even if it did, if you're writing a polemic, if you're writing against someone's worldview or someone's theology, of course you're going to dip into it because the people you want to get the message would never get the message if you're writing about something altogether different and you weren't using their material. This is like the most normal thing in the world. If you want to, write something that addresses a specific something else, well, the people who are reading it have to be able to tell that that's what you're doing. It also sort of presumes that texts and beliefs are the same and coterminous. They are not. In other words, a people, Israelites will just say, can believe something for centuries, for millennia before ever writing it down. They could pass it on orally. I mean, oral culture is a big deal in the ancient world. So the idea that they didn't believe something until we have a text for something is just, again, pardon the expression, it's just boneheaded. It just fails to make this basic distinction. Now, I understand that's an easy thing to forget because we try to deal with primary source data, and the primary source data that exists for us is stuff that was written. I mean, I get it. That's just a reflex. You go to the text. I'm a text guy, so I understand that. But people have to realize that, hey, when the guy sat down and when he took a seat on his butt and he started writing something with a pen, that isn't the first time he had a thought. It's also not the first time his people had a thought. It's not, and his ancestors, were not people who had no thoughts prior to that event. I mean, these are the simplest, most obvious things in the world, but somehow they tend to escape critics, again, especially amateur critics, but they'll even escape, scholars, because again, we're sort of riveted. We get this little kind of myopic, tunnel vision here on the text, and we kind of forget that, well, we can't really make statements about a people's intellectual, you know, repository and have that be coterminous with texts. Thinking and writing are two different things. One came after the other. It just, again, it's very obvious when you think about it, but a lot of people don't think about it. So I would ask, hey, please, could you think about that before, criticizing too much?
Yeah, and also given the notion that the Old Testament relays like unscientific things back then that we know are wrong, like there comes the non sequitur that they were wrong about God as well.
Right, right. Because, let's put it in religious terms, because this is what people are usually shooting at. So they'll take somebody who believes that God is behind the Bible, that God is the ultimate point of origin for this. Nobody I know believes that God was the immediate point of origin, like humans didn't write the stuff. I mean, this is not an X-Files episode, okay? You know, the Bible is not a channeled book, and it never claims to be a channeled book. God used people. And if those people that God chooses aren't giving us science that would satisfy a 20th and 21st century audience, well, that might tell us that the God who prompted those people to write wasn't really interested in that. Because if he's a deity, he probably could have picked somebody better or waited to the 20th or 21st century to accomplish that if that was his purpose. So, since that doesn't get accomplished, the logical thought would be, well, he probably had something else in mind that wasn't concerned with science. Again, when you actually stop to think about what the assumptions are, again, we're assuming, God for the sake of the conversation here, if God is behind this and God is providentially preparing people to write and moving them to get this or that down, or putting them in the right time and place so that they'll produce this thing that he's going to use later on in somebody else's life. If you string all those things together and they extend just from the simple thought of theism, what's more coherent? God exists or he doesn't. That's the beginning point for all this stuff. So if you're gonna concatenate those things, and then something that's produced doesn't satisfy a modern worldview, again, the logical conclusion wouldn't be that the deity forgot something or or did a boo-boo. Okay, the logical conclusion would be, well, that probably wasn't even in the picture. Probably didn't care. And so again, that's actually my view. So I kind of get a kick out of people who criticize the Bible for not being what it wasn't supposed to be. And I'll ask them, what do you get mad at your dog for not being a cat? Do you get mad at your son for not being a daughter? I mean, if you can explain how your method, how your approach makes any sense, then we can have a discussion about that. But the approach doesn't make any sense to me, and so I tend to be critical of the approach back at the approach, for those reasons.
Yeah. The main verses behind the theme of Unseen Realm are Psalm 82 and Deuteronomy 32, yet most mainstream scholars such as Mark S. Smith, John Day, William Deaver, Pete Enns, and many others hold that these verses mean something different than you and other scholars like Richard Elliott Friedman and Richard Hess do.
Mhm.
Like
And by
Deuteronomy.
the way, Friedman and Hess are also mainstream scholars, so I am not out of the mainstream, but I know what you mean.
like Deuteronomy 32, originally meaning that Yahweh was originally a minor desert god that was given territory by the Most High, incidentally El, and Psalm 82 having Yahweh in the role of Baal in the Baal cycle when he rises up and challenges the gods. Like I think Anderson did a peer-reviewed article on it. The Christian and Jewish scholars among them are, of course, just relaying what they believed the Israelites back then thought, not what
Mhm,
is actually the case.
mhm. I would say for your audience, if your audience wants sort of a place to go online, for my thoughts on this in more detail, they should go to Google and Google drmsh.com and then the keywords Psalm 82, monotheism, and archive. I've created a page where I archive my papers on this that are, published, but you can still access them online for free. Let me just say, since you threw Pete Enns into the mix here, um, in theory, I don't have a problem with the notion that God could have told biblical writers or led biblical writers to certain thoughts about himself in stages. In other words, I think it's a myth on the other side. And I think this would, I don't know if Pete's shooting at this or not, but I think some scholars could shoot at this, so I'm going to bring it up. The notion that the biblical writers all had the same thoughts about God all at the same time, or that over time they never could have changed. I think that's a myth. I mean, God certainly could have told them a little bit here, and then later on a little bit more, corrected this or that, because other doctrines develop through Scripture. Kingdom of God is a real obvious one, but there are a number of things that develop over time. So in principle, I'm not opposed to that. My problem with it is that I don't think it makes sense because of the data. And I think a lot of the arguments promoting the evolutionary trajectory simply do not make sense and are actually easily contradicted by data. Let me just give you some examples here. There's an assumption that Elohim, plural Elohim.
Mhm.
Elohim is a Hebrew term that's often, most of the time, used for the God of Israel. It's sort of becomes a generic term, but it can also be plural, gods, put an S on the end of it. Well, there's an assumption that, hey, in passages where it should be translated plural, that shows polytheism. And you ask, well, why? Well, it's because they're gods there. Okay. Um, why is it then that biblical writers would use the same term Elohim of the disembodied dead in 1 Samuel 28:13? Or they use the term in the plural for the gods of the nations, while they're saying Yahweh is the God Elohim of all Elohim. That tells you that the biblical writers aren't using the term to state an ontology, okay? Because they would be hopelessly muddled in their thinking. It tells you that they're not the Elohim aren't all the same. They're not just interchangeable. And in fact, the biblical writers take great pains to deny certain attributes to other Elohim. And Elohim has nothing to do with a set of specific attributes. But since that's the way we think about the letters G, O, and D in modern times, we assume that biblical writers thought the same way about the word Elohim. See, when we see the letters G, O, and D on a page or on a screen, because we're Western, because we're part of the Judeo-Christian tradition, our brains just default to, oh, G, O, and D, that's omniscience, eternality, omnipotence, omnipresence, all this string of attributes. And so when you put an S on it, it creeps people out. Well, that's we can't have that. But we assume, again, that the biblical writer is using Elohim and thinking the same way about that term when they're not. And how do we know? Well, it's because of the way they use it. So this is why in my writing I say something. Look, this notion that Elohim has something to do with a unique set of attributes, and therefore when it's plural we have polytheism. There's something wrong with that because it leads us to absurd conclusions, like a biblical writer would have thought that his dead infant, who's now part of the disembodied spiritual world, is on the ontological level with Baal or Yahweh. That's ridiculous. Nobody's going to believe that. There's no proof for anybody thinking in these terms, but they're all Elohim. So there must be no. Let's try to think a little bit better about the term. All the term means, you would use Elohim as a biblical writer to describe any entity, any resident of the disembodied spiritual world, regardless of their ontology or regardless of where they are in the hierarchy. Elohim is like a synonym for ruchot, spirits, spirit beings. Okay, that's what it is. So that's one problem, and they're just a number of these. Like a year ago, we had our first Naked Bible conference, and that's the name of my podcast, Naked Bible Podcast. And so I did a presentation on the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls in regard to this assumption, because you'll read in literature, scholarly literature, that, well, when we get to the Second Temple period, that's the intertestamental period, and especially the Hellenistic era, the biblical writers are they don't want to see other gods, okay, because they've evolved to monotheism now, and the other gods are dead, or they want them to be dead, or gosh, they hope they're dead, or something like that. And so now they talk about angels instead of gods. Well, the Septuagint translators, sorry, they didn't get the memo. Because if you actually look at all the places where the Septuagint translators have to render Elohim, they go from Hebrew Elohim to Greek. There's only 3 or 4 of those instances where you don't have theoi, or some plural of theos, gods. So they don't have any trouble having gods in the Hellenistic era in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. It's the same thing in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are 180. I know because I counted them. This is part of my dissertation. There are 180 or a little bit more instances of Elohim in the plural in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and 15 or 20 of those are specifically in divine council passages, these quote unquote pantheon passages. Now, I've got news for you. The very same language that supposedly before the exile that Israelites, they were polytheists, and then by the time they emerged from the exile, they've achieved the breakthrough of monotheism, and they're denying all these other gods exist. Well, the very same terminology that's in pre-exilic texts is in post-exilic texts, word for word, phrase for phrase, and it's about 6 or 7 times more. Okay, so how does the evolutionary trajectory conform to those data? That's what I want to know. Okay, but nobody ever looks. I can point you to articles, and I do this in my published articles, where I'm not going to give the person's name here. People can go get the article. It's the one in the Tyndale Bulletin on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, there are scholars who will articulate this idea that we've transitioned from Elohim to angels, and they'll be quoting Dead Sea Scroll text, and they'll quote 5 or 6 texts in the article. If you look at the text, the word for angel never appears. It's still the plural word for gods, Elohim and Elim. The word for angel, Malach or Malachim, doesn't even appear in the text. But they're making an argument for this transition and quoting texts that don't even represent what they're saying. Now you say, how can they do that? It's because they've just been taught the paradigm. Nobody questions it. I could just go on and on with this. To be fair to your audience, this is my dissertation, so I kind of swim here. Okay, Psalm 82, or let's Deuteronomy 32, El giving Yahweh a piece of turf. Well, that's wonderful until you do 2 things. Until you look at Deuteronomy 4, 19 through 20, which everyone in the literature knows is the parallel to Deuteronomy 32:8. It says, beware lest you raise your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the host of heaven, you be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them, things that the Lord your God has allotted. There's the language, from Deuteronomy 32:8. He's allotted them to all the peoples under the whole heaven, but Yahweh, the Lord, has taken you. He doesn't get it like, oh, thank you, El. Thanks for this little piece of land. No, he takes it as his own. So that language doesn't reflect there. And if you go back to Deuteronomy 32 and verses 6 and 7, guess what? We have El and Baal epithets attributed to the lone Yahweh in the 2 verses prior. So the question is, if we have polytheism in verse 8, why is the polytheism messed up in verses 6 and 7 when they're identifying the 2 with the 1? It just doesn't make any sense. And you got scholars. Go ahead.
It's argued that 32:8 was reflecting an older tradition.
Oh, of course, because everybody listen out there, sit down. If you're driving, turn off to the side of the road, okay? Because we all know that manuscripts come with dates on them, don't we? No, we don't. It's a guess. It's an assumption that is brought to the text as to when a manuscript variant, this difference, happened. You have to impose a chronology on the texts, and then argue after your imposition of your chronology to that conclusion. And all I'm saying is, look, you can't, there's no way to know when these changes happen. And you know what? It wouldn't matter if it was older, because I'm arguing on the basis of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Septuagint, all this other stuff, that on both sides of the chronology, you get the same phrases. Again, there's no idea that the Septuagint translation is pre-exilic. Nobody in there, unless they occupy an insane asylum, would say that, okay? We know when the Septuagint was translated, and they are perfectly free to use plural Elohim, B'nai Elohim. The phrases of Deuteronomy 32:8 in that late material and the Dead Sea Scrolls are even later than that. So it is I got to be blunt, it's a lame argument to just move that back as though it means something. It's not a meaningful statement, because the same language shows up exponentially more often after this evolution to monotheism has supposedly taken place.
Well,
And I know that I'm in the minority here, because I did my dissertation on this at a secular university. My advisor was Jewish, but to his credit, he found the topic interesting, even though it ran contrary, to some fundamental things. But my work here has passed peer review on a number of levels here. I'm not just making stuff up. I'm saying here are data that are not being thought about well, that are just sort of not even looked at. And in some cases, we're making claims that the data actually contradict. So we need to do a little bit better here. Now, I would never argue something as silly as all Israelites, believed in the lone Yahweh, the ontologically unique Yahweh. Of course they didn't. It's going to be like today. I mean, you can't even get Christians to, people who would call themselves Christians, you can't even get them to agree on Trinitarian articulation. Even the groups that claim a Trinity will talk about it differently, Eastern Orthodox versus like evangelical or something like that. And then you'll have Christians who are oneness Pentecostals. You can't even get people to agree now on really fundamental things. So of course, in the ancient world, it's not monolithic. But my argument is the biblical writers, and we're looking at their material. This is the text. The text as we have it, taken in context with all this other data, does not justify this evolutionary perspective. It just doesn't. It just doesn't. It's based upon semantic misunderstanding, and in some cases exclusion of data, and in other cases just really kind of poor thinking about data.
while we're on that topic, do you hold that Yahweh and El are different versions of the same Almighty God that were seen as distinct by many Israelites, like given the anti-El polemic we see in Hosea, as Chalmers argues? Or is the latter a more perverted version of the former, or
Well,
is it more complicated than that?
you can have both, because you can have the biblical writers saying, look, we're trying to produce this thing that people later are going to call the Hebrew Bible, to make the point to you Israelites out there that this El and Baal thing from Canaan, we're not doing that. I mean, I have a whole published article on, and this is drawn from my dissertation, on the divine council co-regency structure from Canaan to Israel. And in Canaan, you had El and Baal, 1 and 2. All right, regent, co-regent. In the Hebrew Bible, you also have two structures, regent and co-regent, but they're both occupied by Yahweh figures. One is the transcendent, invisible Yahweh. The other one is the visible Yahweh, the one that appears as a man. So what my argument is that the biblical writers are essentially adapting, or coming up with their own version of a king co-regent structure that would have been known from the ancient world, just sort of across the board, really. But they're looking at the spiritual world this way, but they're rejecting the notion of two separate deities, El and Baal, running the show. And for them, it's Yahweh in essentially two Yahwehs. The Yahweh occupies both slots, and this is the beginning. This is the kernel, source, point of origin for what would later develop in Judaism as the two powers in heaven idea.
Right.
That used to be part of Jewish theology.
Right. The angel of
Yeah,
the Lord being the second Yahweh.
right. There's all sorts of ways that I think this regent and co-regent structure are conveyed. And so you could have a biblical writer trying to articulate a point of that, and you could still have an anti-El epithet because they're trying to get people out of the Canaanite pantheon structure thing. They don't want them going down that road because it affirms two separate deities, and they're trying to get them to think a different way about, who runs the heavens, who runs the show. And it sounds, I mean, to a Christian, it doesn't sound so weird because Christians have this concept of a Godhead, but you think, well, the Israelites wouldn't have been thinking that way. Well, yeah, they actually really could, and it's not just Mike. I mean, after my dissertation was done, after I'm out a few years, Benjamin Summer at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. I mean, he's not a Christian or an evangelical. He's Jewish. Okay, he's a rabbinic scholar, ancient Near Eastern scholar. He came out with a book called Bodies of God. And if there's Christians in your audience, you're going to have to forgive Summer because if you read his book, he's going to sound like a modalist sometimes, but he's not sensitive to the way, to the Christian debates on how to talk about the Godhead are. So cut him a break. But he says point blank in his books that the idea of a Godhead, specifically a Trinitarian Godhead, is completely compatible with the Hebrew Bible. Now, you cannot make a statement like that, A, and not know the data, and B, think like this evolutionary trajectory thing. It's not consistent. So, I don't think the biblical writers are like coming up with a new deity and they're smashing the other two together. I think it is more complicated than that. I think they're trying to help people, help the Israelites focus on the one God of Israel, but yet they're again, I don't know, because I wasn't there either. I don't know if the right word is adapting, or again presenting a similar idea in a different way, or what. I don't know what the right vocabulary is for that, but they want people to affirm that there's only one deity in charge of everything. He could be a regent and co-regent. He could be two persons, because you're going to have passages where the invisible Yahweh and the visible Yahweh are present at the same time and yet distinguished. Okay, there is this talk in the Hebrew Bible. There really is. The Jewish community for 4 or 5 centuries in the Second Temple period, who felt very free to debate on the identity of the second Yahweh figure, they're getting that from somewhere, and they're getting it from their Hebrew Bible. They're not just making it up. Okay, it is in the Hebrew Bible. It's just that a lot of Jews, I would say 99% of Jews today, don't know about it because it was declared a heresy later in the 2nd century AD, which again I don't think is coincidental. That coincides with the birth of the Jesus movement, or the early church. And I don't mean to sound like it's anything sinister. The Jewish community there is doing what you would expect them to do. They're circling the wagons. They're trying to keep people from becoming Christians, because the Christians are just saying, look, we know who the second Yahweh figure is, the one that came as a man in the Old Testament. Well, he really came as a man this time because of the incarnation. It's this Jesus guy. I mean, they're going down the whole road, and they're proposing Jesus of Nazareth as a new candidate for the second power. And that's just too much, for the Jewish community. It's a big element in the parting of the ways. And so the Jewish community is taking steps to just run this, to try to prevent this leakage from their own community. So they declare the second power discussion a heresy. We don't want to hear about it anymore. They forbid their community from reading the Septuagint because there are certain passages in the Septuagint that would favor the Christians in this debate. And they take all of the texts of the Hebrew Bible, and they decide to standardize them, and they come up with the Masoretic text that's going to be the text of the Jewish community from there on out, about 100 AD. They're doing things that are logical, but few in the Jewish community even know that, and frankly, the Christian community even know that this transition actually occurred. And my point is that, look, for 400 or 500 years, they're talking who's the other Yahweh guy. And they're getting that from somewhere. And I think that was the theology of the pre-Israelite biblical writers and the post-exilic. They're the pre-exilic and the post-exilic biblical writers. I think it's consistent. It does develop, but I think it's consistent. And so the text as we have it reflects that theology. My argument is that it does not reflect, and again, this is all, I'm saying this deliberately, it does not reflect a polytheistic belief system on the part of the biblical writers. The masses, God only knows what they're believing because they don't have Bibles, for one thing. They're just going to believe what they're told or what they're not told. They're just going to guess. They're going to wing it. I mean, again, it's just like today. It's no different than today. It's never monolithic, and it never will be or can be.
And on a related note, what do you make of the theory that Yahweh merged with El, like in the case of Baal? Like we see with battling the dragon god Leviathan and the divine warrior persona in general. Like many compare that to the merging of Ra and Amun in Egypt, as well as Marduk and other deities in Babylon.
Yeah, I don't
That
think Yahweh's sitting out there in the spiritual world saying, "Gosh, I need to merge with one of these other deities." So I don't really like, the merging language. I don't know if that's a good way to describe it. What I do
synchron.
know, right? What I do know is that the biblical writer wants his readers to think, okay, here's this L story in my head floating around, and then here's this Baal story floating around in my head. I think the prophets and the biblical writers want people to know, who's really in charge of this stuff that this one story has L in charge of, and this other story has Baal in charge of. You know who's really in charge of all of it? Yahweh. And so they put Yahweh in both boxes. Okay, that's the goal. That's the theological goal. So I don't know that using a term like merger or even syncretism is the right way to talk about that. Again, all I think we can really do is describe the sort of the phenomena of the text, that this is what they're trying to accomplish. And we ought not to try, because we can't, to be honest with you. We can't psychologize the writers. We can't like know, when you wrote this was the exact train of thought that led you to write that sentence. Okay, we can't really know that. We can know that they wrote it, and the effect of it is something we can judge. And so that's where I try to camp out. What does the text say, and what's the theological impact of what we have here? The theological impact is a co-regent structure that is like a co-regent structure of Canaan. And that's nothing unusual, by the way. I mean, every ancient Near Eastern civilization had an ordered spiritual world. I mean, in other words, they didn't have the gods like Keystone Cops. All right. In the spiritual world, we would assume that if they're highly intelligent and if they're powerful, that they want and they accomplish order in their own world. They imposed kingship here. They want order here. So logically, they want order there. And so they make the simple set of assumptions. And the metaphor that's used, there's a bunch of metaphors, but one of the main metaphors is this divine council, thing, because that helps get the point across that the spiritual world is orderly. It gets the point across as to who's in charge. It gets the point of across as to the concept of rebellion and obedience, all this kind of stuff. You need these things. You need to write these things in a way that people will understand, because they can see kingship, they can see earthly authority, they can see all that. And so what they take away from it, is what I'm really interested in. What's the impact of the phenomena of the text? Because we can all sit here and psychologize the writers, and at the end of the day, we don't have a prayer of knowing if anybody in the room is right. Okay, because we can't reproduce the things that were in their head that led up to the thing they wrote. All we've got is the thing they wrote. And again, we also can't impose a contrived chronology on the data. We don't know when a lot of this stuff was written in terms of chronological order. And so my objection is the chronology that the critical scholars, for the most part, impose on the text, this evolutionary trajectory from polytheism to monotheism, it is so flatly contradicted by data that follow that it just doesn't make any sense to me. It's
like
like
you,
nobody got the memo.
you apparently get some criticism by a few uber liberal readers for your views on Israelite religions, such as Elohim, which you take to mean a generic term for spirit beings. Like, you don't necessarily buy the idea that the Israelites viewed the spirits of the dead ancestors and prophets like Enoch, Melchizedek, Moses, Samuel, and Elijah as gods, like even in the Second Temple period, or even angels, as was the case in Ugaritic and Canaanite religion, or
I'm
polytheism.
not. I'm not sure I'm following the question. What
Like,
what am I not saying in the question?
like these are long questions. Like, you don't
Break it
buy the
down.
idea that the Israelites viewed the spirits of dead ancestors and prophets, the above mentioned prophets, as gods.
Mark, okay, let's just stop there. No, I don't think, again, I don't think that the people writing the biblical text and the people reading the biblical text, and again assigning some importance and trying to have fidelity to it, I don't think they're sitting there thinking, "Hey, Grandpa is a god now. I wonder if he's out there creating a world somewhere." No, I don't believe they're thinking that at all. I think the language is they do believe that their
Well,
ancestors are still alive. They have a life of some other nature, some other place, the underworld, the afterlife, whatever. So I do think it means as at least that, but I don't think they're like turning into superheroes or something.
You also don't.
that actually sounds a little bit like Mormonism.
It does. It does. And I'm not a Mormon, so I feel free to reject it.
You also you also don't buy the idea that angels were gods, like in how the Ugaritic Canaanites believed.
Yeah, well, the angel is a functional term. So again, in my book Angels, I spend the first chapter talking about semantics, which I think a lot of biblical scholars fail to do. I'm just going to be blunt with that. There are essentially three buckets. Okay, the biblical writers use terms. Here, this is the first bucket. There are terms that describe what a thing in the spiritual world is. Those are ontological terms. Things like ruchot, like spirit or spirits. Elohim is a term that describes what a thing is. It's a spirit being. Okay. It doesn't really say anything about attributes or rank or hierarchy or roles or function or anything like that. It just that's what it is. It's a spirit being. And then there are terms that describe rank in hierarchy. Okay. Or some kind of administrative order. That's bucket number two. These are council terms, divine assembly, and all that kind of stuff. Okay. And then the third bucket, I think, is the biggest one. And these are terms that describe function or role, what a thing does. So there's what a thing is, where a thing ranks, and what a thing does. Okay, three buckets. Angel is in the third bucket. It's a messenger. So in that sense, a malach, an angel, a messenger, is an Elohim, because the Elohim just means it's a spirit being. But it doesn't mean that they have the certain attributes of Yahweh or any other deity, because we have to look at the way those deities are described. We don't know, and frankly, in the Hebrew Bible's case, angels don't get certain attributes, certainly that Yahweh possesses, and they wouldn't have the same level of power and ability even in Ugaritic material. So, that's like, depending on how your question is read, the answer could be yes or no. So I don't quite know what else to do with that. But we need to stop merging terms. We need to stop merging semantics of terminology, because it creates confusion. Not only like in the early church and the average Christian. I mean, they have no feel. I mean, what church tradition does is it takes all the terms of the Bible and smashes them all together and calls it an angel. That's just not accurate. It's just it creates all sorts of confusion and tension between both the Old and the New Testament. To just be really frank about it. It's why I can go into a church, and if I just went in there and started talking about Elohim, the divine council, people are going to look at me like I got two heads. And I might hold the very same theology. I'm a standard Christian Trinitarian guy. Okay, I hold the same theology this bunch does, and they're going to think I'm just some kind of wacko, because we're using the same terms, but we mean quite different things, and that needs to be addressed. And what I write, I try to address that, especially in the angels book, because everything's not an angel. That's just a job description. It's a job description that a particular member of the spiritual world has on any given day or whatever. That's all it is. It's a job description. It is not an ontological term.
Like, and because you don't.
Oh, I was gonna say, well, of course, not everything is angels. Politics is pretty much confirms that.
Also, like,
in that case, everything's a demon. Oh boy, there's a demon joke in there somewhere. But
demons in office. Like, you also don't buy the idea of polytheist monolatry in general. Like, because of this, you get accused of having religious conservative bias. Like, how did you come to your position, and what are your biggest reasons against the consensus view among critical scholars?
Yeah. Well, this is a good question, because all these terms, monotheism, monolatry, polytheism, henotheism, they're all modern terms. So we have modern vocabulary that we're trying to impose on ancient texts, and we're assuming that we're capturing ancient thinking. Not really. I mean, there are disconnects, there are problems with all of them. Polytheism, again, as we use it, assumes that all of the gods, all of the Elohim, are essentially interchangeable and have the same attributes. I don't think for a minute that a biblical writer thought that because of the way they use the term Elohim. Monolatry is better because then that says you should only worship one. Okay, so that much for sure is true. The question is, does monolatry address the distinction between the ontological distinction between the one worshipped and the other ones? And the answer to that is no, it doesn't. Monolatry, by definition, concerns only which the one you're worshiping. It doesn't make any ontological statements. So it's better, but it's still inadequate. Henotheism suffers from the same problem. Henotheism, the idea again that you got a bunch of gods and one of them, somehow either through a conquest or some nature event or whatever it is, in an ancient culture, bubbles to the top, and then that becomes the top deity. Well, I mean, you could look at the Hebrew Bible in some passages and think, oh, that looks like henotheism. But again, if you're a henotheist, you assume that, well, tomorrow or 100 years from now, another deity might be the best one. And so the question is, did a biblical writer really think that? Did he think Yahweh was replaceable? Did he think Yahweh could be toppled by a deity that's equally powerful, equally, having equal attributes? Did he really think that? And my answer to that is no, they didn't think that. So again, henotheism is better than polytheism, but there are gaps in what it covers terminologically. And monotheism, again, is a difficult term. It's a modern term that really, if you read Nathan MacDonald's treatment of this, it's Deuteronomy and the Meaning of Monotheism, he traces the monotheism as a term back into the 17th century. So that's a difficult term because it assumes that there can only be one God that exists, at least in the way that we talk about monotheism. Because if we have other gods existing, that would be polytheism. Well, why do we think that way? It's because we think of the letters G, O, and D as having something to do with a specific set of unique attributes. And that's the way we think. That is not the way a biblical writer thought about Elohim. So all four of these terms I don't like. Okay, and I don't like because they're bad. I don't like them because they're inadequate. So what I tell people is, look, rather, you got to try not to be a modern person here. Resist the impulse to stick a label on something. Instead of trying to come up with one word that's a good label for something, let's just describe what the biblical writers believed. And that's what I try to do in my books. I don't come up with another label because there really isn't a good one. So we're kind of stuck. And so again, if I were cranky right now, I'd say, look, don't be lazy. Don't look for a label. Just take a minute and describe what the biblical writers would affirm and what they would deny. I mean, noodle that for a little bit and then try to describe it. Maybe come up with the elevator speech for that, 30 seconds or a minute. You don't need a label. Labels are inadequate. And so that is why I land where I do, not because, I took communion or something. It just, again, I get these things thrown at me because that's the only way people can think. And you know what? Even though I'm the target of some of that, so you might think that's my problem. It ain't my problem. It's your problem. Okay. The fact that I'm coming to a conclusion you don't like doesn't excuse you from trying to actually understand why I get there. Okay. Because if all you're going to try to do is come up with a label or come up with some convenient explanation without actually listening and noodling it with me a little bit, well, I can't help you. I can't do that for you. So you need to do that yourself.
And speaking of polytheism, this is kind of a joke to bring up in an interview with an actual scholar, but once in a while,
Try me.
once in a while, a village atheist or a neo-pagan will bring up a couple verses where God would otherwise look weak, such as Judges 1:19 with the iron chariots defeating the men of Judah, and Kings 2:3, where it would seem that the Lord lost a fight to Chemosh, as was told in the Mesha Steel, where the Moabites defeated the Israelites and stole Yahweh's relics.
Right.
Like,
because we all know that God had to deliver the Israelites in every circumstance, no matter what. Right.
They usually bring up the fact that there was a prophecy about them defeating Moab and that getting overturned by another god. Like instead of
it doesn't matter in the least. Let's talk about second Kings 3, because they're missing two things, at least two things, maybe more. Let's just take the bigger issue of prophecy, which would basically take another hour-long show to go through. But prophecies frequently, I don't know if it's fair to say that it's most of the time. That might be an overstatement. There are actual studies on this that I don't have the studies memorized, but it may be. I mean, it's a significant amount. Let's just put it that way. I don't know what the percentages would break down here, but prophecies frequently come with conditions. And I'm not talking a simplistic conditional statement like if then. There are other things lurking in the Hebrew text or the context that create conditions for a prophecy. And in many cases, again, I think you used the term village atheist or something like that here. The village atheist will not even be aware to even look for this stuff. And you got to look beyond English. There are actual studies on this conditionality and prophecy and whatnot. It's actually really interesting. But since that's the long, analysis, let's cut to the short one. In
like
Second
that,
Kings,
that's what I call the angry atheists who don't come and
yeah, right. Do you really want to try to understand the issue or not, or do you just want to spout something? It's up to you. So Second Kings 3:27, the outcome of this Moab, the Chemosh, thing. So the king of Moab, then he took his oldest son who was to reign in his place and offered him for a burnt offering on the wall. And there came great wrath against Israel. And they, the Israelites, withdrew from him and returned to their own land. Do you notice what the verse never says? We aren't told that the wrath comes from Chemosh, are we? That's read into the passage. Like the deity, the Moabite deity is venting against Yahweh. And Yahweh's cringing in the corner. Oh, I give up. It's not in the text. We don't know who the wrath comes from. It could just as well come from the people or from the army. Maybe they were really ticked that the guy just killed his son. Maybe they liked the son. We don't even know how old the son is. Maybe he was popular. Maybe he was like a grown man and he's one of them. We don't know anything about the circumstance. Okay, second, the text doesn't say that Yahweh turned tail and ran. It says the Israelites turned tail in response to the wrath, whatever its source was. So here you have a bunch of Israelites who are supposed to believe, these are Israelites now, they're supposed to believe in their hearts that their God is the God of gods, the God who defeated the Egyptians at the Red Sea. And what do? Do they have faith? They even have a prophecy. Do they even believe it? Do they believe what God said? No, they don't. They just blink and they turn tail and run. So why is it God's fault if he chooses not to deliver unbelief? I got news for you. God says in a lot of places, I'm not going to deliver you if you don't believe. This is a predictable result. Why does Yahweh get blamed for this as though he took a beating? There's no textual proof for it. And the counter to it is that he will, in some cases, even punish unbelief. It's like ignored.
you sort of get that idea from as was told in the Mesha Stele.
Well, of course it's going to be told that way in the Mesha Stele. Who's writing it? Moabites. I mean, that Moabites aren't. Let's reduce it to some really simple things. Question: should we expect Moabites to do Israelite theology?
Absolutely not.
Of course not. Okay, Moabites are going to put the best spin possible on the event, and they do. Isn't it interesting that the Hebrew Bible writers don't do that? The Hebrew Bible writers just say, "Our guys were chicken." Okay, they didn't believe, and they took they turned tail and ran.
I don't think we need to stress the ridiculousness and illogic and the implications they give, but I like to hear an actual scholar's take on the suggestion that the same God that parted the Sea of Reeds and was said to have battled Leviathan, or any kind of God in general, was thwarted by man's tools.
Yeah, yeah.
With the
You know,
iron.
and it's a good point. I want your audience, and I hope they're getting the impression here. Look, there's very little of what I have said in this interview that requires a PhD. I would say next to nothing. You know what's more important than a PhD? Clear thinking. Okay, asking good questions. Okay, you're not going to get a PhD for that, but it's really useful. It's really valuable. So don't get enamored with degrees and all. Okay, the guys with the PhDs, yes, we are good for something. Okay, and that is data, ferreting out data. Yes, some questions are going to depend on the knowledge of the original languages. Absolutely. I didn't waste my time getting a PhD. That isn't what I'm saying here. What I am saying is that you don't need a PhD to think well. Okay, you can do that on your own. And it's my job. This is why I do my podcast. This is why I write the books. I think it's my job as a scholar to give you more nuts and bolts to think well about, so that not just sit there and entertain yourself by doing Bible study, but so that if you're interested in this stuff, you got a lot more grist for the mill, and go at it. Get busy doing it. um, I wish more scholars would do that. But please, if you're in the audience, you should not be thinking that you've got to go out and get a degree. You just don't. You just don't.
Like, yeah, but what's your take on the even though the people I deal with on a regular basis don't normally think about this stuff.
Oh, I know.
I'm curious as to a I'm curious as to a scholar's take on the Iron Chariots debacle in Judges
In
119.
in which passage? Judges 119.
Yeah,
I have my software open. Let me go to that. Oh, let's see. So the Lord was with Judah. He took possession of the hill country, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they had chariots of iron. So the question is, who's the antecedent? Let's see.
they like to imply that God was thwarted by man's tools, even though that makes no sense in any context.
Well, the part of the problem is, okay, and here you go. Here we have a case where an English translation is going to say, and I would imagine most English translations would say this, but he could not drive out. Guess what? We don't have the word he in the original language. We don't even have a finite verb form, like a third masculine singular verb form. We instead have an infinitive, and we have to supply a subject to that. So it would be overreaching the text to say that Yahweh is the subject of this verbal action. It's not a necessary conclusion in any way, not because of Mike's theology, but because of the text. You could just as well, make it an it. It could not drive out Judah. Judah couldn't do it. Or they could not drive. The subject in terms of the person and number is ambiguous because we have an infinitive form, and infinitives do not have person and number. This is grammar. And I know, again, the village atheist is going to go, well, sorry, but the text is what it is. So don't make an argument that you think the text supports when it actually doesn't.
Yeah, and like not only does that not make any sense, like the idea that it was defeated by a minor god like Chemosh when the Egyptian pantheon was no problem for him. Like best excuse I hear for this one is the Exodus never happened tangent, and Yahweh made a mockery out of Dagon on numerous occasions.
Well, that's true. I mean, God can, do what he wants, but the reverse, the flip side is also true. God allows he doesn't allow, he actually, it depends on what passage you're in. So some cases he's like, whatever, I don't care what's happening to you, do you deserve what you're getting? Or other times he's actually taking the Babylonian army and crushing his own people for their disobedience and sending them into exile. Okay, the fact that Israel, like Judah, winds up, or well, the 10 tribes just get scattered everywhere. The fact that those things happen don't mean that Yahweh was defeated. In some cases, the scripture is very plain that he actually does this to teach people a lesson. And sometimes the lesson is really harsh. And so you could read that, into Judges too, because it's the period of the Judges, and it starts off the cycle of Israel forgetting Yahweh, and then they get oppressed, and then they cry out to Yahweh, and Yahweh raises up a judge, and then the whole thing repeats itself like 8 times in the book. It could be one of those too.
All right. Well, we're coming up at about an hour right now.
Yeah, let's just ask one question from Brass.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on Leviticus 25, 44 to 46, which seems to talk about chattel slavery of foreigners, as well as the so-called sex slavery in Exodus 21?
Sex slavery in Exodus 21.
It has more to do with the Midianite story, I believe.
No, no, it's selling your daughter to some as a slave to somebody.
Uh,
Is this from Judges or from Leviticus or what? Where are we going
It was
here?
from
And
Exodus.
by the way, I mean we have time to pick up 6 and 7 on the other list. If you want to cut that out, edit that out, make a note to yourself. I think with a lot of these situations, you get Israelites with their boots on the ground doing things that seem perfectly logical to them given their culture, as opposed to God sitting there thinking, I can't think of a better solution, so I'm going to command you to go out and do this. We have a very flawed assumption that the Bible, these are Torah references, so let's just say the Torah here. We have a very flawed assumption that the Torah endorses a culture. It does not endorse a culture. There is no culture that dropped from heaven from God. And that includes the theocracy of Israel and what is behind a lot of this Torah stuff. I mean, in the examples you give, like Deuteronomy, if a man has two wives and he likes the one and hates the other, about not disowning the firstborn of the woman that he doesn't like, okay, it never tells you go out and create this circumstance. Go out, God says go out and solve your problem this way or do this thing. It reports that they do those things, and yes, God doesn't like send lightning bolts and say you idiots, like what are you doing? First of all, again, there are plenty of examples where God has picked a people. He's picked them in second, first, whatever it is, millennium BC. They already have a culture in place, and God is essentially content, whether we like it or not, of using what he's got to work with. Now, we know from biblical theology that the theocracy was not a divinely handed down culture that was supposed to be here for time immemorial. How do we know that? Because biblical theology informs us that what God is really up to is to get humanity back to where it began, back to Eden. Okay? It's about defeating, all of the forces of chaos to get things back to Eden. Well, back in Eden, there was no Jew-Gentile distinction. There was no Jewish culture. There was no theocracy. Okay, there was no subjugation of women. Right? There were none of these things. And we know that that's the way the Bible is directing things because of the way the Bible ends with the new heaven and new earth in Edenic terms. And those late chapters in the New Testament draw heavily on the Old Testament. You get this stuff in the prophets. The writer of Revelation is not just making stuff up. He's drawing from an Old Testament vision of a new Eden, not a new Israel, not a new theocracy, not a new, something that's smaller than Eden or smaller than the whole world is supposed to be Eden. This is what God wanted in the first chapter of Genesis. And God is going to have his way. That's the message of biblical theology. Now, along the way, there's going to be lots of bumps. God has to break into history, call a dude named Abraham. Okay, his people are going to do this, that, and the other thing. They're going to do some good stuff. They're going to do some terrible stuff. His descendants, the Israelites, they are what they are. God made a promise to them that I'm going to use Abraham's seed to work the plan back to Eden. It's going to take a long time. You know why? Because God chose to have humans be indispensable parts of working back to Eden. God's not going to turn everybody into robots. This is why we still have evil. Why do we have evil if there's a God? It's because God at some point, namely at the very beginning, said, I'm going to create beings who are like me. They're going to be my imagers. And I'm going to share my attributes with them so that they can be like me and fulfill their destiny. And what I want them to do is I want them in my family. I want them to be partners in this world that I have created for them. And I'm going to come to earth and live with them. I'm going to be their God. They're going to be my people. And we're all going to be here together and enjoy it. There's no deficiency in me as to why I'm doing this. I just like to do it. I like to create things like me, and I want partners and kids. And so I'm going to create beings, humans, who are like me. And when I share my attributes with them, if I take their attributes away, namely human freedom, they're no longer like me. And that isn't the way I want things done. So, yeah, we can get angry at God that there's evil. But you know what? There's evil because God would rather have the fallout, pardon the pun, of that plan than to never have us at all. That is the story of biblical theology. And we make a terrible mistake. Instead of looking at the meta narrative, we zero in on Torah passages and assume that God is endorsing this, whatever this point of culture is. Israelite culture was planned to be obsolete. It's planned obsolescence. But you're only going to discern that if you're taking the big picture look, again, the meta narrative, as we like to say. So I know that was kind of a long roundabout way of talking about these kinds of passages, but again, I think that there's a big bucket that basically a lot of these go into. They are what they are because of who the people are, and God is,
Well,
he's working with what he has at his disposal, and he's not going to change them. He's not going to say, well, I'm going to work with you, but first you got to stop doing this and clean that up, and over here. Now once they enter into covenant, then some things are going to be about believing loyalty. You don't do certain things that other people do when they worship their other gods, because then it becomes about their relationship with him, the exclusivity of that. But most of the time, more broadly speaking, it sort of is what it is.
All right, time for 2 more questions, and then we'll call it a night. You said on your podcast that you plan on doing a follow-up to Unseen Realm. Like, is it gonna be a more rigorously academic version of the original, which was more aimed at a popular audience and submitted for peer review?
I've gotten this question now a couple of times in the last week. There is no Unseen Realm sequel in progress. I'd like there to be one, but my wish is not corresponding to reality and probably won't for a real long time. I would say when I get into that, um, you know, let me put it this way: I'm not going to repeat Unseen Realm in another book. That's the first thing. Unseen Realm is very well sourced. I mean, it's not all this. I have over 6,000 sources in my Zotero bibliography for all things Divine Counsel and Unseen Realm. So of course I don't put that all in the footnotes. All right. It's quite well sourced in terms of peer-reviewed literature. It's not a book for scholars, though, because it's not intended to be. I don't get into source critical questions and parse verbs and do nuts and bolts philology and all that stuff. I let the sources do that. I let the stuff in the footnotes do that. So I'm hoping readers who want more information will go out to the footnotes and go search for that stuff and go find them. And many have. And I think that raises the bar for their friends and their churches, which is part of what I hope my work propels. I want people to look beyond my books, which is why I clutter them with data, with footnotes. Okay. So I've gone through the material to ferret out the content. I present it hopefully in a decipherable way to non-specialists. And that's what I do. Scholars who want more, hey, use a library. You know how to do that because you're a scholar. All right. And I would presume that anybody else who cares will again do that instead of criticizing something in the book at a distance. Go look up the material, and just do some work. I mean, it just takes work. So I can't reproduce all of that in a book. But I try to shoot for, again, let me put it this way. I literally have over 6,000 references of stuff that I talk about in Unseen Realm, or that I would layer onto Unseen Realm content in a subsequent book. I am not hurting for data. And the fact that all that exists tells me that I don't need to produce much more of that. What I need to produce is stuff for the non-specialist. And so that's what I try to do. I just try to get people a distillation of what scholars talk about, again, hopefully in a readable, decipherable way, and then try to equip them, try to produce something useful for their own study.
Are there any projects you have in mind for the future? Like, I've heard rumors from our mutual friends at Sensible Apologetics that you are interested in doing an Unseen Realm movie or video game. Tell us about that. And you also said, I guess, that you have an Unseen Realm cruise ship coming up. How'd you
that's the most real of those three things you mentioned. The Unseen Realm movie. I'm not planning one and would never plan one. However, Faith Life, my former employer, again, they make Logos, the Bible software. They have filmed what we loosely called in the building, the documentary, even though that isn't in for my taste. Honestly, I don't know what to call it. So, they have created a film that is based on the book. It's like a talking head film, with other scholars in it, and I, of course, will be in it. I don't know when they're going to air that. I mean, they did one a few years ago called Fragments of Truth. It was about New Testament manuscripts, and that was a Fathom event. So they may be thinking that. I don't know. I mean, honestly, nobody tells me. They didn't tell me when I worked for them. They're not telling me now. So yeah, that exists, but I don't really know what's beyond that. Video game, there have been people who have suggested this to me. I don't have any skill in that area and don't have any funding for it, but I'll give the idea a thumbs up. Well, that would be cool. But that's
Yeah,
kind of where
like all
where it's
these,
at.
like Adam and Eve and all these other cavemen in Eden and Yahweh battling Leviathan and all
Yeah,
that.
yeah, I mean, what I'd like to see happen is, I mean, my next book coming out, it comes out in a few weeks. It's called The World Turned Upside Down. The subtitle is Finding the Gospel in Stranger Things. Okay, the TV show. So what I've done in that is this is literally what my method was. I self-published this little book called What Does God Want? Because I wanted to be able to control the content to give that away in English, not in English, because this will sell the English to fund giving it away in other languages. Because I have a nonprofit that is doing that. But I took the content of that book, which is for new believers or seekers, like, okay, what does God want? I mean, what's the whole point to all of this? And I answer that question. It's a short book. It's very readable. I mean, it's got almost 90 reviews already on Amazon. But then I took that and I mapped the meta narrative story I have in that book to Stranger Things. And honestly, it was easy. Stranger Things, I don't know if your audience likes the show or not. I love the show. It is good storytelling, and it captures so well the human condition, the fact that we are as lost as Will Byers. We cannot save ourselves. Our salvation really focuses on something external and supernatural too. I mean, there's so many big meta narrative things in the show, and I don't think they're doing any of this intentionally. They're not doing Christian stuff intentionally. It's just that good storytelling will map over to good storytelling. And so, what I would love to see happen is I would love to see people create video games and write other books like the Marvel Universe, the DC Universe, anime, video games, whatever. Map the storytelling elements to the meta narrative of Scripture, the supernatural meta narrative of the Bible, because I think it would really communicate important theological stuff to a visual audience and to an audience that just all that stuff's going to be a bridge to them. It'll speak really well. So I've done that with Stranger Things. I'm hoping that will prompt people to try to do the same thing with my content. That'd be awesome. I hope they do it.
Well, it's kind of like what Jordan Peterson suggests about superheroes being
Yeah, exactly.
like demigods.
And whenever that comes up, I always recommend what's the guy's name? Christopher Nolan, I think. I mean, there are a bunch of Nolans that get confused
Yeah.
here. But the guy who wrote the book, Our Gods Wear Spandex, and don't let the cover deceive you. It's kind of it's a comic book cover, but it's really a good book, and it's about how the superhero universes track on really big archetypal religious themes, and how they convey the same thoughts just in comic book form. It's quite good, and there are a lot of things out there like that. But that's, to me, I think that's one of the more accessible books. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, I highly recommend that book just to get your mind going on what the comic book storylines are really, what they're really tracking on. It's a lot bigger, than you might think.
You know, I was thinking if the Unseen Realm video game gets made, the loading screen should just be like an animation of a Bronze Age goat herder just hitting a village atheist over the head with a club.
I thought you were going to say something about one of my pugs there, but go ahead. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen in there. I mean, for anyone thinking about doing the video game, I'm sure they'd have to get some kind of usage agreement with the publisher, Lexum. I can't give that, but I think it's a great idea. I would hope somebody would do it.
All right.
We should say something about the cruise. I said
Yeah.
the cruise is the most real. This was actually my wife's idea. She has a friend who was a travel agent. We are going to have a Naked Bible cruise in October of 2020. So if your listeners went to Naked Bible Tours, they would find the website for that, or they could just sign up for my newsletter. We have something in there. But yeah, it's going to be in the New England and on into Canada above the New England states in the fall. So it's going to be awesome.
Not in the
But
islands.
no, not this one. I mean, this is like a first, like kind of a trial run for the idea.
Oh,
But we know lots of people who've gone on cruises, and from what we've heard, I know somebody who's done it, and then people who've just attended. But the cruises are always looking for content experts in just about anything, so they can present lectures and talks during sea time. Because it gives other people something to do while they're at sea. And so that was the beginning of her idea with her friend, the travel agent, and this is just what came out. So yeah, we're gonna take a crack at this. People
I've been
can
on,
already sign up for
I've been on a cruise once. I got sun poisoning. We were at the equator.
it. Yeah, well, I don't think that'll happen with this one. But
No,
if we ever go down to the equator, yeah, wear your
my
sunscreen, I guess.
my stupid ass went out without sunscreen the first day, and I did everything
go.
else except step foot on the islands.
All right. Well, we're going on about an hour, 20 minutes. Is all the questions good?
Yep.
Yeah.
Got any final thoughts?
No, I actually like this conversation. I think we did get to go through a bunch of details. We got to go through some biblical scholarship, and I don't know, I just had a good time with this.
Yeah, it was
What
fun.
about you?
All right. This has been part 1 of Heiser House. Next time we'll be discussing his other books, Reversing Hermann and Angels, where we will talk about the angels, Lucifer, the old gods, all that good stuff. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Purple Pill Philosophy has another treat for you. This is Heiser House part 2. Heiser, how was your day?
It was busy because we're moving. That's probably all I need to say. Anyone who's moved will understand.
Well, it's great to have you on, Dr. Heiser.
Yep. Thanks for having me back.
And this interview is about your second book, your second magnum opus, Reversing Hermann.
Okay. If you want to refer to it like that, sure.
The central themes of it are the concepts of the second divine rebellion in Genesis 6, and further explored in the Book of Enoch and the New Testament references to that book found in Jude and 2 Peter as part of Jesus' mission.
Mm-hmm.
The Book of Enoch serves as an explanation to why just about every ancient culture worshipped the pantheon of deities and explains where they come from. But considering the details in the book and the literary genre, isn't Enoch like 98% fiction?
Well, there's fiction in Enoch for sure. You know, all of these texts are describing. I mean, Enoch's not making stuff up wholesale. I mean, there are details that it sort of makes up. Like some of the way that like the sons of God or the Watchers, sort of the divisions among them, the terms used for them. Some of that is what's the right word? Original, to them. But what's actually happening in Enoch is the writers of. Are we going to be serenaded? is that the theme for Enoch? Okay. What's actually going on is the people who are writing or contributing to Enoch, and Enoch is as a book is actually several books. But what they're doing is they're interpreting Old Testament data. They are doing exegesis. They are looking at their Old Testament, and they are seeing data points in the Old Testament that are not connected in the Old Testament necessarily. A few of them are, but a lot of them aren't. But the data points necessarily live in the Old Testament. And so the writer of Enoch and some of these other Second Temple books are just asking simple questions like, how does all this stuff fit together? What does it mean? How can we understand these data points as a whole? And so they're trying to interpret, what they find there. Now, in the case of the Second Temple period, specifically the Enochian material, there's other stuff going on too, because the Dead Sea Scrolls, several scrolls like the Book of the Giants from Qumran is the best example, inform us that the writers there in that period had some direct knowledge of ancient Mesopotamian material that was actually the backdrop to Genesis 6:1 through 4 that we, of course, don't have. I mean, scholars know what it is, but honestly, it really hasn't been assembled in detail until since 2010. But the ancient, again, Second Temple Jewish writer had access to this material, and those writers could understand why Genesis 6:1 through 4, and we'll include verse 5 in here, um, why that stuff's even in the Hebrew Bible. And so they're taking the knowledge of that material, the backstory to Genesis 6, the early verses of Genesis 6, and they're taking the data of Genesis 6 and also the ensuing material about the giants and whatnot, and they are trying to put all that together into what looks to them like a coherent whole. And you say, well, what about the Greco-Roman material? Like Hesiod's Theogony, the Greek Titan story. Well, as major studies of that material will tell you, and one author is Burkett is sort of an expert on this. Bremer, Jan Bremer, M.L. West, another book. I mean, there are whole studies, whole scholarly books on how the Greek stories, like the Titans, actually come from. They are derivative from ancient Near Eastern, i.e., Mesopotamian material. So even that, isn't like whole cloth, new. And so again, if you're living in the Second Temple period and you're a literate person, you're a scribe or a priest or, religious thinker, and you're aware of all this material, this is the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise is to take all these data points and mine them and put them together into a coherent whole and figure out what was the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible writer trying to accomplish. Why this story? What are they shooting at? What's the point? And of course, Peter and Jude are part of the Second Temple period. And so they're going to be familiar with this material, and some of it is going to inform what they write in the New Testament. So the point here that I'm trying to make is, the point here is that nobody's sitting on their butts in the Second Temple period asking themselves, hey, I want to get an A in creative writing. What can I make up? They're not doing that. They're interacting with a lot of material, and they are doing exegesis and they are doing theology in the process of interacting with that material. Yes, they do have original things that come out of that exercise, but by and large, they are interacting with material that already exists.
All right, and you mentioned that one Japanese scholar who specializes in the subject. What's her face?
Yeah, Annette Yoshiko Reed she's an important scholar in Enochian studies. She has a book on the reception, both in Judaism and Christianity, of Genesis 6:1 through 4, and the Enochian Watcher story. So she contributes regularly. She's a recognized name in the field of Enochian research. She's not the only one. Lauren Stuckenbrook is another one. He is sort of ranked as one of the experts in this material. Archie Wright, who I've had on my Naked Bible podcast, is another one. He's the guy who wrote the book, The Origin of Evil Spirits. It was actually his dissertation, then it got published. But there are a number of people who sort of focus on this material. The major cuneiform expert who focuses on this material is Amar Anus, and his is the work published in 2010 that went back in all the Mesopotamian flood story stuff specifically, not to look for comparisons between that material and the biblical flood, but specifically the first 5 verses, the whole Sons of God episode. And he came out with an article in 2010 called On the Origin of the Watchers, where he traces all this stuff back to the Mesopotamian story of the Apkallu. And that Mesopotamian backstory can account for every element of Genesis 6:1 through 5. But it's only been 2010 since anybody's really bothered to do that. So if you wrote a commentary on Genesis earlier than that, it by definition is out of date and obsolete on this matter. And so that's the disadvantage, to this discussion, because people will pull commentaries off their shelves. I don't see anything about this, the sons of God or the sons of Seth and all this kind of stuff. It's like, well, not really. You're operating sort of with without meaningful and significant data. So you need to go back to scholarship and get caught up, get up to date.
Yeah, Sons of Cain, all that mess.
Well,
Let's.
Yeah.
that's sort of like appealing to a modern evolutionist with Darwin's original writings.
Yeah, yeah, really, because it's like people don't realize. I mean, I guess they realize it. I hope they realize it a little more in the sciences as science changes all the time. Well, so does every area of scholarship. You don't have people get degrees in things and then, well, I got my degree. I guess there's nothing to do now. Somebody pay me to sit on my butt, and play solitaire. It's not the way it works. Every field, things come along that require reevaluation of the field, and that's what scholars do. It's what people in medicine do, and law, and everything else. It's just the way it is.
All right. What most people are con- are curious about. Let's talk about the old gods. Ra, Zeus, Odin, Quetzalcoatl, Amaterasu, all of them. Are they like real and now, or did they exist long ago?
Well, if you affirm a biblical worldview, okay, let's just start there. You're dealing with three rebellions. They are both supernatural and human rebellions within the span of Genesis 1 through 11. You have the first one, which is the Satan figure, the original arch enemy. Um, he's the original rebel. Then you have the sons of God in Genesis 6. And the Nephilim become part of this because they are the product of that. And then their disembodied spirits are what become known as demons in Second Temple literature. You also get hints of that in the Old Testament. And then the third group are the sons of God assigned to the nations who become corrupt and sow chaos in the nations and so on and so forth. So these are different entities or different groups. So to try to map them over to some other complex, sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's not. With national gods, okay, and just some that that's probably going to be mappable to the third group, the gods over the nations. And if you affirm a biblical worldview, you believe these gods exist. I mean, this is what Scripture teaches. But it doesn't mean that you know they get assigned names by every culture. Every culture has a sun deity. In Egypt it's Ra. It's like mostly Ra, but the sun disk is a different deity, the Aten. They will name they will give names to deities they believe are behind natural forces. The Old Testament actually demythologizes natural forces and puts them under the command of Yahweh, a lone deity. But typically that's not the way it works. Every natural phenomenon has a distinct deity. There are deities who are allotted to specific countries and specific regions and specific towns. So I mean, that much you get in the Old Testament worldview that maps over fairly nicely, to some of these others, but they get their names because of attributes they are perceived to have, geographic regions they are supposed to govern. I mean, there are a number of reasons why a supernatural figure that a given culture believes is real is going to get the name and the description and the epithets that it does. So that can actually vary. You don't necessarily have neat map ups. Now in the ancient world, when one culture would go to war against another and conquer them, they could decide, well, we're either going to dump those gods or we're going to identify those deities as this particular deity, or our deities over here. And so they would map them over, and you get compound names, and you get sort of a kind of an accumulation. One set subsumes another, which complicates things. But generally, if you're talking about national deities, that's going to be the third set in biblical thought.
The way always understood the gods is in three categories, like personifications of nature,
Yeah.
mythologized heroes and deified kings, and fallen angels as pop culture knows them by. Like, what are they really?
Yeah, I mean, you get they're spirit beings. Again, in a biblical worldview, these are spirit beings. They are intelligent entities, if we can use that term. I don't. It's kind of difficult. We have to use terms like this that aren't perfect, but they're serviceable.
Yeah, like are
Um,
some of them active spirit forces and others being half human Nephilim offspring of the Watchers that once ruled over
yeah, you
their
yeah
nations?
you yeah you get all those categories. Now, the Watchers, the offenders of Genesis 6, they're never said to rule over nations. All of the ancient traditions, including the Mesopotamian traditions and the Greek traditions, have them being sent, being judged, punished by higher authorities either the singular God of Israel or some other higher up deities from another pantheon. But the ones who cohabit with human women are sent to the abyss, the Abzu, Tartarus. I mean, the names vary, but they're sent to the underworld, and that's where they live. That's where they're imprisoned until the time of the end or some apocalyptic scenario.
Right.
So they're never said to govern nations, but their offspring, again, is where you get the demon idea, and they can come and go, but their fathers, so to speak, cannot. The ones who are over nations, that's a different group. So in biblical terminology, the principalities and powers are not demons. Demons are something different, and they're actually lower status. But you know, we as moderns, especially in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we tend to smash all these things together and use you know the white hats are angels, the black hats are demons. That's too simplistic for the biblical text, but that's just the way people are used to talking about them.
We might talk about demons in our next talk on your book, Angels.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, demons are it's interesting to people just to hear, well, they're not the principalities and powers, it's something different. So
Right.
yeah, we can get to that at some point.
Relating to the to this question in Greco-Roman, Hurrian, and Hindu mythologies, we see this recurring cultural memory of gods battling and overthrowing the previous generation of gods that we know as the Titans or Asuras. Like
Yeah,
they would be the Watchers, correct?
yeah, yeah. That's going to be there's some sort of rebellion against higher authority. Okay, that sons of God, watchers, and then the groups you just named.
Although
So
they
that
although
has to be
they,
put down.
although they do appear to live side by side in Egyptian and Norse mythology, with the giant serving the antagonistic role in the latter.
Yeah, yeah. It's not uniform, by any means. But like in Mesopotamia, this is viewed positively, because the Apkallu, the ones who before the flood, they're described as 100% divine. After the flood, they are, quote, of human descent. So that group before the flood gets credit for assisting the people of Mesopotamia with civilization. They are called culture heroes for that reason. They're the great civilizers, and so they rebel against the decision of the higher gods to destroy humanity in a flood. In the Mesopotamian story, humans are noisy, they're not doing their job, let's get rid of them. And the Apkallu are like, well, good grief, we put a lot of work into these people.
Up the
So
landlord.
yeah, they're not in favor of this, and so there's a rebellion. And to preserve their knowledge, they do that by again having this hybrid relationship with humans. And on the other side of the flood, that's why the Apkallu are referred to as being of human descent. And they also are giants. Gilgamesh is one of them. He is lord of the Apkallu, and described as a giant in at least one text from Ugarit about this whole episode. So there you have kind of a side by side, relationship, or a positive one, because the Mesopotamians are like, these are good guys because they preserved our civilization for us. Those of us who survived this flood, we're glad that they did this. But the higher gods, of course, are not glad, and they send the Apkallu to the abyss. But the biblical version is quite different. This is not good because what these guys teach humanity: arts of warfare, arts of seduction, pharmacopoeia, drugs, that get used in not necessarily necromancy, but you get the idea of just potions and whatnot, to produce altered states, astrology, idolatry. These are all things that the biblical tradition and the subsequent Second Temple tradition views as terribly negative because they're self-destructive. They lead to human destruction, and they turn people away from Yahweh, the Most High. So that it's quite a different perspective.
And part of
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, yeah. I mean, that goes like into the talk about magic, and I
Yeah.
had also brought up during the Exodus and so much how the Moses, was able to like basically overpower the magicians of Egypt or whatever with their
Mhm,
snakes.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering how that worked, like the distinction between a magic and a miracle.
Yeah, it seems. I mean, there. If you remember the Exodus narrative, they don't really get too far in miming what Moses and God is doing through Moses. And the priests actually tell Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." Like we're we're tapped at this point. So when it comes to the manipulation of the natural order, they run up against just things they can't do. And scholars have you know, they've gone back into Egyptian texts and they've wondered, well, how were the Egyptians able to do this? First of all, they don't reverse the water turning to blood. They make the problem worse. They imitate it. And then with the snakes and they've come up with some, kind of naturalistic means or magical means, again, sleight of hand kind of means that Egyptians, based on their textual material, could have used that could be in view, in this story in Exodus. But again, once the what Moses is doing starts either reversing or producing chaos out of the natural order of things, the way nature's supposed to work, they can't do that. So that I think helps answer the question, that where the line is. There's mimicking, and then there's actual control over nature. Those are two different things. So there's sleight of hand versus, wow, this person actually has command over nature. Like the cycles of life and so on and so forth.
Part of the theme of your book is that the so-called Titans were the ones cast into Sheol, and part of Jesus's mission, which was to judge them after he died on the cross and before he rose from the dead, right?
Yeah, when it comes to the second group, again, the sons of God, the Watchers, again, the number two rebellion. If we understand the effect of that, I mean, there's basically two effects, and one plays out in the Old Testament for the most part, and the other one plays out for the most part. Well, maybe equal parts. Maybe we can be fair.
Was it just them while the other gods remain active, or what's really going on?
Yeah, the middle group are responsible for two things. They raise up a competitive seed. Essentially, they produce their own imagers to imitate what happens in Genesis 1, and of course, the raising up of Israel from Abraham supernaturally. So they become earthly lethal threats, the Nephilim and the giant clans. Now, according to the Old Testament, that whole issue dies out during the time of David. The last of those remnants are dealt with. But the second trajectory is actually the one that's more important, that doesn't get noticed. And that is how this contributes to the proliferation of human depravity. For your listeners, they might get the importance of this by asking a question. How in the world do we go from Genesis 6:1 through 4, which is the weird sons of God story and the Nephilim and all that, to verse 5, which says, and God saw, that the wickedness of man was great upon the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. It's this statement of depravity. So how do we get from sons of God and human women, being sort of victims or whatever, to depravity? Well, the answer is the backstory, the Mesopotamian backstory, which is the Apkallu teaching humans certain knowledge that they were not meant to have, and that results in this corruptive effect. Now, the writer of Genesis assumes that you know that backstory. We don't. They did, because they're living closer to the time period.
So the role of the Upkalu Nephilim was that of Prometheus.
Yeah, I mean that's the kind of thing you get, and you can see the connection point, into the Greek world, the Greek version of all this, and that's the easiest one to see. But in terms of what the Messiah is supposed to do, the Messiah is supposed to fix all three rebellions. The first one results in the loss of immortality, and you get death and estrangement from God. So the Messiah is supposed to fix that. Well, he does through the resurrection, through the sacrificial atonement of himself. Okay, so that's the means we are brought to God, and we're going to rise again because we're part of the body of Christ as believers. So those problems are solved by the work of the cross. The second set, again, the bloodlines, the Nephilim stuff, those guys die out, not coincidentally. Think about this. Who are the ones in the Old Testament that kill them off? In biblical material, it's Moses, Joshua, and David. All three of those are types. It's typology. They are foreshadowings of the Messiah. That's not a coincidence. So in the Old Testament, the one trajectory is taken care of, but then we have to deal with human depravity. Well, how does the work of Christ address depravity? Again, if you know about the resurrection and the ascension, those two things are crucial and necessary to the coming of the Spirit who inhabits believers, who helps them resist depravity and kickstarts the process of sanctification for the believer. Okay, so that's how it works there. The third group, the principalities and powers, again, what the nations that are just inherited at Babel, they're assigned to these lesser, sons of God, lesser Elohim. Well, they rule the nations. So how does the Messiah fix that? That might be the most obvious one, because you see it at Pentecost. Okay, the scattered Israelites are drawn to Pentecost. They hear about the Messiah. They believe. They're empowered by the Holy Spirit. They go back home to the nations among whom they're scattered, and they begin to evangelize. And eventually we get a guy named Paul called out specifically to take the gospel to the nations and bring them back. This is the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, because right after the nations are disinherited and put under the other gods, God makes a covenant with Abraham that he includes the nations in. Abraham, you and your wife are perfect because you can't have children. She can't have a child. She's too old. That's perfect. It's ideal because I'm going to do this myself. And so that the result of this, the Israelites, they will know that the whole reason they exist is because I'm kickstarting, a human family for myself, and I'm doing it supernaturally. They can take no credit for this. But while I'm doing that, I'm going to make a covenant with Abraham and his offspring that they're supposed to be a kingdom of priests. That's what Exodus calls them, and a holy nation, so that they can draw the nations back to the true God. Because in Genesis 3, that through you and your seed, all of these nations will be blessed. So the Messiah is the ultimate fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. We know that because of Galatians 3. That's what Paul says. If you are Christ's, you are Abraham's seed and heir according to the promise, regardless of what you are ethnically. The people who are the real children of Abraham are those who believe and embrace the Messiah, who is the seed that would come from Abraham to reverse all of this stuff. So the Messiah he is the solution to all three of those things. So the middle group, the sons of God, yeah, they're in prison. I personally think, and you guys know because you've read Reversing Hermon, I think Revelation 9 is actually the prophecy of their release to again sow chaos before the day of the Lord, before the end of days. So I think that's what's going on there. They'll be the finality of their judgment will happen, in the eschaton. But in the meantime, the Genesis 6 curse is being reversed through the Holy Spirit, you know, who is but isn't Jesus. The three times Paul refers to Jesus as the Holy Spirit. And doesn't mean there's no Trinity. It just means the Lord is the Spirit, just as Jesus was God, but he's not the Father. So the Spirit is Jesus, but he's also not Jesus. He's also something different. This is actually where Trinitarian thinking comes from. This overlap between these three, but we're getting a little far afield now. But that's how the reversal of Genesis 6 again is working post crucifixion, post resurrection.
And the gods of the nations are still active, or are they?
Oh yeah. I mean, again, Paul half a dozen times when he talks about the resurrection, he connects the resurrection to the defeat or the nullification or his word is the stripping away of the authority of the rulers and the principalities and the thrones. He uses this language. What is he talking about? It just sounds kind of weird. Well, what he's getting at is that, look, these entities were given their authority by the Most High back at Babel in judgment. It was a judgment on the nations. And God, because the people who live in these nations, they're still people. They're still created in the image of God. God still is interested in them. He wants them ruled justly and properly according to his good character. But that's not what happens. We know that from Psalm 82, because why is God angry at this bunch? He's angry at them because they enslave their populations. They sow chaos among the nations. And of course, Deuteronomy 32:17 and a few other places in Deuteronomy 32, they're turning the hearts of the Israelites away from Yahweh to worship them. So the whole thing just sort of, goes to hell in a handbasket, pretty quickly. And we have this situation where we've got these lesser authorities who were given their authority by God, who have now turned adversarial. So what happens at the resurrection of Christ? Why is Paul associating that event with the nullification of their authority to rule the nations? It's actually pretty simple. When you think about it, Paul could go into a Gentile town and he says, look, I know what you guys are thinking, because this worldview, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview of the Hebrew Bible, is in your own writers. It's in Plato. It's in a bunch of Greco-Roman texts, that the gods allot people to worship these gods. And there's a whole system of allotment going on. And so he looks at the Gentiles and says, look, I understand what you're thinking. You're afraid. You're afraid that if you leave the worship of your gods and turn to Jesus, okay, the Messiah, the God in the flesh that I'm preaching, that you're you're in trouble. You're afraid that this is going to put you in a real bind with your deities. I understand it, but here's something you need to think about. Those deities that that you believe you're allotted to, and you are, were put in their position by the Most High. And the Most High just became a man and died on a cross for you and rose from the dead and has now ascended back to heaven. And he is the one who gave them their authority, has now taken it away. Because at the resurrection and the ascension, here's Matthew 28:18. This is the first verse of the Great Commission. All authority is given to me in heaven and on earth. Okay, this whole idea of inheriting the nations that the resurrected Christ gets associated with. Paul would say, look, you do not have to be afraid. The Most High, the one who is superior to all these gods, he is saying, you can come back home now. And not only can you, but I want you to return. Don't be afraid of these gods because I am superior to them. Come back home. This is Paul's gospel to the Gentile nations. And it is a reversal of the whole Deuteronomy 32 Babel, event, the judgment.
Mhm. What also seems to be a universal theme across separate cultures are giants, dragons, minotaurs, and hybrid animal creatures. Like, is there some truth to any of that? Like, are they spirits that appear to humans in that way and aren't physical beings that left any trace, or what's the deal on that?
I a biological claim to me, and that's certainly a biological one. I'd like to have some sort of evidence for it. However, biological evidence. However, if we are going to assign these sorts of abilities to deities, okay, that they can do this or that. And by the way, I'm not a deity, so I don't know how it works or what their limitations are. It's not in my job description.
Well,
Um,
according to
but
some of your fans, you're sort of a deity.
say that again.
I said, according to some of your fans, you're sort of like a deity.
Ugh, yeah, well, they they just need a hobby. If it's, um, but I think that we have to at least hold out the possibility that the gods could, the Elohim could appear in these forms, and that gives rise to how they're talked about. I think that would at least be a possibility. I think the greater likelihood, though, is that again, how deities are talked about is naturally derivative from the world that the writers themselves are part of, what they experience. I mean, we just like we're forced to use the language of latitude and longitude, the language of spatial relationships, to describe a place like heaven or hell or the underworld or whatever, a place that doesn't have latitude and longitude. You can't plot it out. We nevertheless, as embodied beings, have to use that kind of language to describe these places. Well, the same goes for how disembodied beings would get described. It's very normal to expect that we would describe them based on things that we do experience, like animals. Okay, this is why the gods live in gardens and mountains and the seas. Why? Because people don't live there. So this is a way of expressing the otherness of the gods and the fact that humans cannot uh, inhabit where they inhabit unless they're somehow supernaturally bidden or put there and protected from what would ordinarily kill them. So it's very normal, again, being in this situation where we're trying to describe the otherworldly place or otherworldly beings, that we have to use the vocabulary at our disposal. We don't have words for things that we don't experience, you know, or things that aren't part of our world. We have to use what we have to express and describe those other things. So I think by and large, that's probably what's going on.
The namesake of reversing Hermon is the mountain where the Watchers landed, right? Or is that just what
No,
is
that's
that
the
just what the
case.
Jew? Hmm?
That's the case. Hermon and Hermon has a long history. It's
Right,
not
right.
just
Is that just what the Jews thought? And if it did happen, when do you suppose it did happen?
no, it's not just what the Jews thought. I mean, again, the Jews are parsing older material, but very negatively. There's a really good article. I don't know if it's accessible just generally on the internet, but it's an article by Edward Lipinski, and it's called L's Abode. and what it is, it's a history of this mountain. All the way back into Sumerian literature, this place was considered to be the mountain of the gods, and specifically a garden mountain, a lush forested garden with plenty of water that happens to be on this mountain. So this goes all the way back to Mesopotamian tradition. And of course, if you're doing that, then you look for Gilgamesh. Yep, you can find material where Gilgamesh is associated with this place, and the Apkallu, and all this kind of stuff, the flood traditions. So they're not, again, the Second Temple writers aren't sitting around saying, man, we got to put the gods on a mountain. Do we have any good candidates? Let's look around. Oh, I like that one over there. No, I mean, yeah, that's the tallest peak that, is identifiable to the naked eye if you're living in that part of the world. That's true. But it actually has a long history that is viewed very negatively by Jewish writers.
And when do you suppose it happened?
Well, I mean, all of this is set before the flood. I don't know if I could put a chronology on the flood. I don't know how we would do that. I'm one who believes, for instance, that the genealogies are selective, and you can't just string them together and come up with dates. Um, that there are gaps, in the genealogies. They're selective for different reasons, various reasons. So I have no idea. I think, you know, you got a flood. It is associated with human civilization. So if we're that's probably a better rule of thumb. When is the earliest evidence of human civilization? Let's just
6,000 years ago.
yeah, something like that. So you have writing by 3000, but you have urbanism, before that. And part of it is, well, how do we define civilization? Again, I don't think writing is a necessary component, although
It
it's
helps.
certainly important. Yeah, but things like a settled civilization, the building of cities, settled agriculture, settled domestication of animals. That's civilization. So yeah, you can push it back to that. So it would be in conjunction, with that, somewhere in the neighborhood there. You could give it a number as far as flooding. If you go with flood models, it depends too. Most people reject a global flood
Yeah.
in favor of a local or a regional one, and there a lot of those science folks who study a regional event would push it back even further, a few thousand years further. They times 5 to 10,000 or something like that. So it's that's about the best you can do.
Also, when do you suppose the events of the Tower of Babel occurred?
Yeah, that's a more interesting question.
I myself always thought of Babel as a compression of loosely connected events, such as the rule of Gilgamesh, the building of the earliest ziggurats, the Akkadian Empire, and that reflected
Yeah,
themes about the Babylonian exile.
what's really interesting is
Sure.
you have to know a little something about Amorite traditions here, because if you're looking at Canaan, the population of Canaan before the Israelites get there is really from three groups. One is a group called the Amorites. Another group comes from the Hurrians or the Hittites, Anatolia, regions in the north there. And then the third group are the Sea peoples, from the Aegean. So all of those traditions, I mean, this is kind of an interesting question, because the Amorites swept through what would be Canaan and Babel and Mesopotamia, you know, it, 2500, 2000 BC. By 2000 BC, Mesopotamia is Amorite. Hammurabi is an Amorite king. He's not native Mesopotamian. He's an Amorite. And so this is the period when you get, these ziggurats and whatnot. But the reason I'm bringing this up is, if you
That's the
look
that's the
at
that's the Neo-Sumerian Amorites, right?
yeah, yeah, and there's a big discussion over who gets, where do the Amorites come from? Typically it's like Syria, the northern area. They sweep through, and again, and what we think of as Mesopotamian, Sumerian Mesopotamian culture, it's actually a lot of those people that come in. Now they get driven out by the Hittites and the Hurrians, but the Hittites and the Hurrians don't occupy. They leave, for geopolitical reasons of their own. But when Nebuchadnezzar comes around, when you have the Neo-Babylonian Empire, he wants to link himself and his empire with the Amorite traditions. And so a lot of scholars view the Tower of Babel as the tower that Nebuchadnezzar had repaired as part of this Amorite glorification process. Now, that would be too long, because is in the early, late, or I always get my chronology mixed up. Early 600s and late 500s BC. But Andrew George, who did the latest critical edition of like the Gilgamesh epic, and he's put a lot of time into this Babel stuff. He has come up with textual references to that tower that go all the way back to that earlier period. So when you said you think that the Babel traditions really do dip into the early stuff, I would agree based upon what George is saying. I don't think you can just peg this at Nebuchadnezzar's Amorite campaign. I do think that there is evidence, textual evidence, to pinpoint, a tower in this place very, very long ago, in these early periods.
And which ziggurat in particular would that be? The earliest one?
Oh, and I think it's Enmeteronki is the one that is sort of the favored candidate for this. Again, and it has a long history. So, um,
Yeah, but isn't that like too late?
well, it is if you're excluding the early textual material that talks about a tower being built on that location. So in other words, there isn't just one tower and one building campaign. There is an earlier tower that is the basis for the later stuff, which is why I think Andrew George's work is kind of important. If you Google Andrew George and Tower and Babel, you're going to come across the textual references that form the basis of his argument. It's actually fairly recent stuff, because George has put a lot of time into this particular issue after he moved on from his critical edition of Gilgamesh. So for your listeners, I would recommend Googling that to get the specific textual references. So, Nebuchadnezzar, now think about this, that both periods actually, the earlier tower and then what Nebuchadnezzar's doing with Enmeteronki is actually, both of them are actually important because, again, this is just me now. I'm not saying anybody has to adopt this position. But I believe that Genesis 1 through 11 was either composed during the Babylonian exile or heavily edited. I'm willing to think parts of it could have existed earlier and then got edited because there's so much, not only Babylonian polemic in those 11 chapters, but lots of stuff that get directly traced to Marduk, who's the main deity figure, during the period of Nebuchadnezzar. Earlier he's a minor figure, later he becomes the major, figure. But for that reason, I think we're wise to pay attention to both traditions, the Nebuchadnezzar, the Neo-Babylonian stuff, and also the older stuff when we are thinking about Babel as far as an event and what it meant.
And which this ties into it because Nebuchadnezzar compares himself, Lucifer is compared to Nebuchadnezzar, but in Isaiah 14. But we'll be discussing
Yeah.
Lucifer in our next talk about your book Angels. But he, or rather the Nakash, who we know as Lucifer, was the first divine rebel, like however many eons ago that was. After,
Yeah.
after the Watchers rebelled as well in Genesis 6, why did God trust the other sons of God when dividing the nation in Babel, knowing they would betray him later
Yeah.
on?
Yeah. That's kind of like, why does he trust us? God has committed himself to having children, creating both humans, embodied children, we call them humans, as his imagers, and before humans, disembodied, lesser versions, disembodied creations who are created as his imagers. In other words, his representatives in the spiritual world. Humans are God's representatives in the embodied world. You know, so when he does that, he shares his attributes with them so that they can indeed image him, represent him. And so once God has decided to do that, one of God's attributes is freedom. This is where we get, free will. You know, God isn't going to go back on it. He's not going to say, boy, I had a brain fart that day. That was a terrible idea. An omniscient being can't say things like that and wouldn't. So God is committed to this path, and he is big enough, he is superior to all of his creations, including these two groups, the heavenly imagers and the earthly imagers, that he doesn't need to strip away their freedom to further his plan and basically to have his way, to restore what was lost in all of these rebellions. So the fact that he is committed to this, again, having both supernatural and human families and partners with him to do things. Again, God doesn't need any of it. He doesn't need them. He doesn't need us, but he has chosen to do this because, personal reflection. I think God just enjoys and acts upon his creative impulse. It's part of who he is. And so once he's committed to this, yeah, this is who he's dealing with. He's dealing with us and our screw ups, you know, and he's dealing with them. This is why Job says, several times, at least 3 times, we get this line that God doesn't trust his holy ones. Why doesn't he trust them? What does that mean? It doesn't mean that every member of the heavenly host is just a ticking time bomb waiting to fly off the handle in rebellion. It certainly means that the potential to rebel is there, but it also means that they're imperfect. He doesn't trust them. Why? Because they're not him. Only he has a perfect nature. And God knows this. So he knows what he's dealing with. He knows when he looks at us, he knows what he's dealing with. He remembers that we are dust, as the psalmist says. But nevertheless, he enjoys doing things this way. He loves us. And so he's willing to work the plan without eliminating us, without either turning us into robots or turning the heavenly host into robots, or just wiping the table clean and saying, who's going to know? This is actually at the heart of Job. The first 2 chapters of Job, with Job's suffering. You know, the Satan there, Hasatan, is not the devil. Again, NCL might talk about this.
Yeah.
But he's doing his job. He's running around looking to and fro on the earth and seeing who is faithful.
The black sheep of the divine council.
Right. And he becomes the black sheep not because he's the devil, but he becomes the black sheep because he challenges God's assessment of Job. So that is both a challenge to God's omniscience and a challenge to God's integrity. Is God telling the truth? Does God know? So he challenged. What was that?
It's like an honor challenge, which was a big deal back in ancient.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, because I remember, like, if you challenged the king's honor, that would be taken as treason.
Yep. Yep. So we have a problem, and this is why God tells him. He says, "Okay," this is Mike's paraphrase. "Okay, you don't think I either know or that I'm telling the truth." Now, I could just, have you guys ever seen Time Bandits, the movie?
Yeah, I like.
Okay.
I like Bill and Ted better, but yeah.
Okay, but you have the evil one. When he looks at his underlings and they challenge him, don't ever talk to me like that again. Then he blows them up. Well, if God does that to Hasatan, guess what? The question he raised is still on the table. Everybody else knows that God just eliminated the challenger. He didn't answer the question, so he can't do that. So what he tells the challenger, the Satan, the adversary, is, okay, I will let you do everything to Job, short of taking his life. And the reason why God says it that way is because he doesn't want the Satan, Hasatan, to come back and say, oh yeah, Job would have buckled if you would have let me do this. No, you can do whatever you want to him, except kill him, because we need him alive so that he can endure and validate my assessment of him. So go ahead. We're going to find out who's right. And we're all going to learn a lesson here, especially you. Okay. And Job isn't aware of any of this, so he's wondering through the whole book, like, why am I suffering? And because God was correct, and in the end, we know how the story ends. God validates him and restores. So that's really it. All of this is at the heart of that story. Again, we're not dealing with the devil there, but we are dealing with an uppity member of the divine council who crosses a line and needs to be dealt with.
Also, at what point did the betrayal of the sons of God take place? The later sons of God, the Olympians, Norse gods, Egyptian gods, all of them.
Yeah, the things, the ones that derive out of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. We're not given a chronology, but I suspect it was pretty soon because of Genesis 11. Because by the time we do get to Abraham, we're not necessarily given a complete chronology, but I mean, if you actually figure it out, it's like a century or a little less if you actually plug the numbers of the patriarchs into this issue. Because Abraham's parents, his father is a pagan. He's a polytheist. He's an idolater. And so that, in biblical thought, is a situation that derives from Babel. So it has to be reasonably close. So I would say, a century after Babel, we've got this problem. As far as the distance between Babel and the flood, again, that's something that's variable. That, again, I'm again one who thinks that the genealogies, have gaps in them. Personally, I think there's a mathematical cipher to be found there. But nobody's come up with anything that's completely satisfactory. There have been some good attempts, but I suspect because of the Sumerian king list, there is a mathematical cipher for that. And the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 10 track on the Sumerian king list a lot. So that's my suspicion anyway.
There's so much we could talk about the first 11 chapters of Genesis
Oh, I
alone.
know, I know.
We're running out of time.
That's a lifetime. Yeah, I got to run because we
There,
have
there,
some
there
company.
seems to be a rise in neo-paganism or heathen
Oh yeah.
religionists, as they like to call themselves in the last 10 years, especially. But would you take this to mean that the old gods are making a comeback of sorts, or is it more comparable to a similar rise in New Age stuff?
Well, I do think. I mean, I'm not one who's really. I'm not married to any eschatological system, so I can't sit here and say, "Oh, absolutely, we're living in the last days," and they know it. Because Paul linked their final defeat to the fullness of the Gentiles. The reclaiming of the nations, and whenever God says that stuff, that's going to reawaken Israel. This is Romans 9 through 11. I mean, I get all that. Only God knows when these things, in terms of timing, are going to happen. So we could be living in the last days. I don't know, but I'm not gonna like camp on a particular position of eschatology and say that's the reason. I think it could be an element. That's about the most I'll say there. But in addition to that, I do think that supernatural intelligences who hate humanity and want to be at the forefront of the demise of humanity, they understand that that in every person there is a hunger for the transcendent, for a transcendent reality, and there is a hunger for mystery. And the current mechanistic, materialistic, atheist view that says the only thing that is real is what you can detect with your five senses, that is unsatisfactory to most of the population of the world. And I think they know that. I think they understand that these impulses are within humans and they're not being satisfied by atheism, and they're also sadly often not being satisfied by Christianity, by Judeo-Christianity. I think we have to own, Christians need to own that, because they make the Bible so boring and want to deny the spiritual reality that Scripture presents. And so I think a lot of people are just ripe for the picking, for exposure to these things, and they're going to pursue spirituality to fill these voids in their hearts. And that's why I think, more than anything, we see the rise in this. It's a failure, of what ought to be the truth being put out there in its fullness, and instead denying most of the supernatural worldview that the Bible actually presents us, and that creates a wedge of opportunity for supernatural beings, the ones in Scripture anyway.
Okay, one last question. The the context behind the reversing Hermon is the references in Jude and Second Peter. Like,
Mhm.
um, does it bear any truth on the matter if they weren't written by Jude or Peter, respectively?
Well, I don't reject Petrine, or what's the right adjective for Jude? Judean
It,
authorship. I don't.
Jesus' brother.
Yeah, I don't know what the right adjective is there to take that proper noun and turn it into an adjective.
Let's
Petrine
just
is
call him Jesus'
usually,
brother.
yeah. Yes, I don't. I mean, there are arguments that they didn't write the stuff, but I still think they did. But at the end of the day, no, it really doesn't matter. If because we have biblical books named after biblical figures, and we have no idea who wrote them. First and Second Samuel, they never claim to be written by Samuel. I mean, we have no idea who wrote them. Job, we don't know who wrote that.
And
You know,
there's a whole can of worms of Daniel.
yeah, yeah, yeah. We just don't know. Joshua, I mean, there's nothing that says that he wrote
Obviously
the
not.
book. So there's a whole bunch of those things. So no, I don't think that is much of an issue at all. Even though I'm still in the camp that I don't see a compelling reason why these couldn't be written by the people who bear their names. Scholars still argue about that. You still have scholars that take both sides of that, either side, I should say.
All right, this is passing our hour mark. Any last thoughts?
No, just thanks for having me. And if your listeners want to find out more, they should go to drmsh.com, drmsh.com. You can pretty much find anything I'm into through my homepage, and of course, books available on Amazon. So just thanks for having me.
You rest.
Nice. It was nice having you on. It was interesting hearing about all this theology and some of the history that went on. I learned a lot of things from this, so it was very eventful. Glad to have had you on, Dr. Heiser.
Good. I'm glad it wasn't dry and toasty.
We might make Angel's interview dry and toasty.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the good guys are dry and toasty. Yeah.
We'll talk about demons also.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, you guys.
Welcome. See you next time.
Yep. Bye-bye.